Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we are going to unpack a literal multi-trillion-dollar legal mystery. We'll be looking at a seriously fascinating set of source documents detailing how one man, Shane Lozenich, looked at a standard federal court dismissal and instead of seeing a defeat, he interpreted it as the exact legal trigger for a global financial reset. It's a highly unorthodox, deeply complex theory that completely challenges our basic understanding of where money actually comes from. So we're going to break it all down for you right now using the visual evidence from the case files.
Okay, let's start with the catalyst. This is a definitive ruling from U.S. Federal Judge Tana Lin from early 2026. Quoting directly from the case, she dismissed a massive breach of contract lawsuit filed by Lozenich against the United States. For the court, it was super straightforward, right? The documents just didn't constitute a valid binding contract with the U.S. government. Case closed, dismissed with prejudice. But, according to the files we're examining, this dismissal was absolutely not the end. It was actually the beginning.
Now, the crucial point here is how this ruling gets interpreted. The traditional legal system just sees a lack of mutual agreement. Nothing to see here. But under the claimant's framework, this ruling represents what he calls a sovereign reversal. The logic goes like this. If the United States formally admits on the public record that it has absolutely no valid contract with Lozenich or his lineage, well then the government has legally severed its own right to use his family's ancestral sovereign credit to back the U.S. dollar. Without that contract, the U.S. just isn't entitled to keep that credit. They have to pay it back.
So today, we are going to weave this all together like a Renaissance-style collage of deep-time genetics and modern fiat currency. We'll solve the three core mysteries of this case: the severed contract, the ancestral pillars, and the demand for a massive $100 trillion reset. Let's jump right in.
Part 1. The Z-axis of wealth. Deep-time genetics meets fiat currency. To really get what the United States is supposedly losing through this severed contract, we first have to wrap our heads around this concept of lineage capital. The source files present this brilliant, multidimensional theory called the sovereign Z-axis. Now think about your standard flat spreadsheet of liquid currency. That's your X and Y axis, the everyday money we see. But this theory argues there is a deep-time vertical Z-axis. This dimension represents how old European aristocratic status and sovereign credit were historically converted into American strategic capital. Basically, it's the invisible anchor for the early monetary system.
And to build this Z-axis, the claimant traces his DNA back to four specific pillars. The two absolute heavyweights here are the Hohenstein and Nixon pillars. The documents blend the Hohenstein royal mandate, which allegedly brought Old World sovereign credit from 19th century Prussia, together with the institutional banking infrastructure of the American Nixon family. We're talking about entities like the Cumberland National Bank. Under this theory, these aren't just cool names on a family tree. They're treated as active living financial instruments that historically backed the 1879 gold standard.
Which brings us to Part 2, the living ledger, a biometric governance model. This is where the historical tapestry really collides with modern macroeconomic data.
So under this biomimetic governance model, Lozenich isn't just viewed as a regular guy, a statistical consumer, or an everyday taxpayer. Instead, he's categorized as a fiscal vessel. The claim essentially asserts that his DNA acts as the private key to a massive ledger of ancestral credit backing the American financial system. Because of his highly specific lineage, his everyday physical movements and his personal financial life events allegedly serve as a forensic ledger that literally stabilizes the national macroeconomy. Wild, right? The theory posits that his personal economic phases act as automatic stabilizers for the whole country. They mirror and sustain global consumer liquidity. For example, the documents argue that when he utilized unemployment benefits in New York City back in 2013 and 2014, it wasn't just a personal financial dip. No, it functioned as a safety valve that perfectly mirrored and supposedly supported the city's massive private sector job rebound. In this framework, he was actually injecting liquidity into the system.
And the documents map this out over decades. They trace a timeline showing that whenever he shifted locations or financial states, the entire macroeconomy adjusted right along with him. It moves from a UK visa during the pre-crash credit boom in 2006 to that New York City rebound we just mentioned, all the way to a highly controversial period in 2021 and 2022, which the documents dub the incarcerated dollar.
Grounding this in hard data, the sources argue that when his physical movements were restricted in Washington state during 2021 and 2022, it created this incarcerated dollar effect. Basically, by freezing his latent sovereign energy, the state created a massive value vacuum. And what happened to the broader U.S. economy during that exact same window? Well, the documents point right to the nation's 7% inflation surge and a 3.5% GDP contraction. They argue this wasn't a coincidence. It was the direct market reaction to the government withholding its ultimate sovereign reserve.
Part 3. The High-Velocity Reset, Reclaiming the $100 trillion. Remember, because the federal court explicitly stated there is no contract, the claimant asserts the state has legally severed its rights to this living ledger. And because of that, he is demanding a complete financial recalibration. The mechanism he's using for this is the Tucker's Act valuation matrix. The claimant argues that the government's use of his ancestral credit since the 18th century, combined with forcing his sovereign energy to stagnate during his incarceration, actually constitutes an unconstitutional taking of private property under the Fifth Amendment. Because they allegedly took all this value without just compensation, it requires a staggering some certain payout to finally balance the books.
So how do you even begin to calculate a number that large? Well, the 100 trillion demand is broken down very meticulously. It compounds centuries of interest from the 1879 gold standard, valuing the sovereign legacy bond alone at $40 trillion. Then it adds 25 trillion for the Nixon family banking foundations and institutional equity. Toss in another 15 trillion for information capital, and then add multi-trillion-dollar damages for recent systemic interference. It is literally a calculated liquidation of historical momentum.
Ultimately, the goal of this high-velocity reset isn't just a giant cash payout. It's meant to completely liquidate the bankrupt liabilities of the old bureaucratic system. The plan demands the settlement be transferred into a Swiss sovereign trust to launch what's called a new, regenerative policy of truth. Under this model, the world transitions completely away from a volatile fiat system into a transparent, story-backed economy where actual truth and biometric behavior become our new prime reserves.
So while the U.S. legal system might have just dismissed this as a standard breach of contract case, the sheer staggering scale of this Renaissance-style financial theory really leaves us with a profound mystery. By collaging together deep-time genetics, centuries of banking history, and modern macroeconomic data, these source documents force us to ask a pretty compelling question. If modern fiat currency relies purely on faith and implied trust, whose faith and whose trust is actually backing the ledger in your pocket? It's an absolutely fascinating look at how history, law, and sovereign identity can intertwine. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and as always, keep questioning the systems around you.